Hello, it's Mr. Rops here, and today we are going to talk about the spread of data, amount of variability. But before we get into the heart of that, let's just take a look at just a few distributions in general. And when we are talking about describing distributions, we always want to talk about the shape, the center, and the spread. And today we're going to focus on the spread, but briefly we'll talk about the shape. And here are two different kinds of shapes that we will experience. The black one here is very symmetrical. It's not perfect, of course, but it has typically two tails that are low and then one hump in the middle. And the normal curve, the bell curve, is very symmetrical. And when we look at the box plot, you'll notice that the trend is that the two whisker parts are about the same and the box in itself, so everything's equal and symmetrical, and this is in the middle. And when it's the tighter this shape here, this bit normal curve here is, the tighter the box is, as compared to a uniform distribution, which is consistently, the numbers are just basically all the same. There's not a lot in the middle and little on the ends, but they're all about the same. And so it is symmetrical to the box plot, but you'll notice that these distances here are all about the same distances, whereas in the symmetrical one, they tend to, the steeper this is in the middle, the tighter this is in here. And so they're not always exactly the same, even though a uniform distribution is symmetrical as well, but it's more than just symmetrical. The other kind of distributions that we often see and deal with are what we call skewed distributions. And you'll see it kind of goes off this way. This is called skewed to the right. This is the tail. It's skewed towards the tail. The higher numbers are skewed to the higher numbers. And if you see on the box plot, you can see that it is, here's the median, and it's stretched out further on this end. And this lower half is shorter, and so it's skewed to the right. So quartile 1 to median and median to quartile 3 are typically, this one's smaller and this one is larger. Skewed left is basically the opposite scenario. Here's the tail here, it's on the left hand side, skewed to the lower numbers, and the whiskers are long here. This bar is often long and that whisker is short, and they're not proportional typically. And those are our four different types of shapes of data. And with our data, our center, what we know about center, well, these are the ones you're most familiar with. The first is the mean, or you guys also know it as the average. It's when you add up all the values and you divide by how many numbers you have. The next one that you know is called the median. And this one here is the middle number. More than just the center, it's the middle of all the numbers when they're assigned from smallest to largest. And finally, the last one, which we haven't mentioned yet, but you've learned in the past, is mode. This is the one that is the most frequent. Okay, it's the one that comes up most often. If there's a bar chart like in this one here, this whole bar here is the modal class. So from 11 to 13 or 12 to 16, this is the mode in this case because it's the largest. This is the mode, this is the mode. And so it's just the most frequent. Those ones I think you're quite familiar with. And it's the one number that summarizes the entire data set. But the center is not always the most important number. Sometimes the spread is more important than even the center. But it's the one at this point you guys are least familiar with. The one spread that you are familiar with is what we call the range. And the range is simply the max minus the minimum value, and it's how far apart the numbers are. One that you've probably heard but don't know what it is called standard deviation. Another measure of spread is also the interquartile range, or the IQR, and that's part of the 5-number summary. If we look at these box plots here, this distance in here, this distance is the IQR. From quartile 3 to quartile 1, you subtract them and you get the IQR. So this is the IQR and the IQR. So this spread is relatively smaller than this spread here because this IQR is smaller. Okay, and finally, the last one that I'm going to mention to you is variance. And variance is simply if you take your standard deviation, whatever that value is, and you square it, then you get the variance. And it's basically like that. Variance is used in many statistical calculations, but it's not used to report meaning very much. And so spread, what the spread is, it's really about consistency. How consistent are your data values? Are they relatively all the same? How consistent is there, which means is there a lot or a little bit of variation in the data? So when you go out and you get data on the same thing, do you expect to get exactly the same value? Is there a lot of variation? Is there variability in the data? So here's a quick idea. And if this is the annual salary in euros, and this is we'll call this the green company, and this is the black company. Which company would you like to work for? And there's no right or wrong answer, it's just different. When you look at the green company, the spread of the data of all these different salaries, annual salaries, is quite diverse. It's quite varied. So it goes from 40,000 euros to 350,000 euros. So that's the range of salaries. Whereas in the black company, your salary goes from 100,000 to 140,000 euros a year. And so if you had to choose which company to work for, which one would you choose? And there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. That's not, the spread of this is larger than the spread of the black company. That's not better or worse, it's just different. If you are conservative and you don't like to take risks and you don't need the biggest and the most, you might want to consider working for the black company because your salary is quite high, but it's not super crazy high. And it doesn't matter what job you get, you're probably going to get about the same salary if you work for the black company because they're all relatively the same. There's very little variation. It's consistent. The salaries are very consistent. However, if you are a risk taker and you really want to get a high salary, then you might not want to go for try and get a job at the green company because maybe you'll end up getting the 350,000 or maybe even here 140,000 or any of these numbers in here. But recognize that the median is 90,000 euros a year. And so 50% of the values, or more than 50% of the values, if you work for green company, is less than what you would be making for the black company. However, you have all these values that you'll be making more than the black company. So about 25% of the green company's salaries are the same as the black salaries. 25% of them are higher than the black company, whereas 50% of the salaries are lower than the black company. So there is a lot of variation in the green company's salaries. And so that's not good or bad, that's just reality and what you make sense of it. And so these are very consistent with little variability. Whereas this one is high variability, and it is not consistent. Okay, and so that's a sense of what the spread is all about. It's about the range of the numbers or how consistent are the variability of the data.